John, if you're ready, then shall we kick it off? Then I'll start. All right, perfect. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think people will still be dropping in after a bit, but let's get the show on the road. Welcome to the monthly seminar series of the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. My name is Dennis Boeris. I'm Professor of Global Security and Technology at Leiden University at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. And my colleague Monica, who I do not see yet among the people, is of course the person who is organizing all this. So thank you, Monica, for putting this together as well. The Hague Program on International Cybersecurity is an interdisciplinary program for the study of international cybersecurity with an emphasis on cyber conflict, mostly below the threshold. And we're also looking at the role of emerging technologies. We study the development of international cyber conflicts, but also, and perhaps mostly, we study the international governance thereof. So we look at international law, we look at norms, we look at strategy, we look at diplomacy, which makes our guest today, John Arquilla, an excellent choice, I would say, to talk to us. So our guest today is John Arquilla. He is Distinguished Professor of Defense Analysis at the United States Naval Postgraduate School. Had a long career at RAND, also a long career as a consultant, as an advisor to the American Department of Defense, and also someone who is a long-term student and scholar of international cybersecurity and analyzing cyber conflict. He's joining us today for a talk on his book, Bitskrieg, the new challenge of cyber warfare. And as you can see, it is both a very catchy title and it has a very good cover, which is sort of the dream of all academics, to bring out a book that is both easy recognizable in form as in content. So the topic, John will introduce himself, but maybe a little bit, it's mostly about how to value and deal with life and conflict in the digital age. What can we do about what he calls weapons of mass disruption? And according to John, these times we live in require a radical rethinking of military and security affairs, diplomacy, and even the routines of our daily lives. We had a small chat before. John will use the time we have, sort of 30, 40 minutes for his presentation, and then we open the floor to questions, which I'm sure there will be. Welcome all. I will hand the floor over to John. When we come to the questions, if you have a question, please turn on your camera so we can see you when you ask a question. John, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Professor, for this wonderful opportunity. I'm a great admirer throughout my life of the work done at The Hague currently and really over the course of the past century. And I am reminded that my personal hero is a fellow whose name was Jan Bloch, who was a Polish banker late in the 19th century, who understood that industrial advances were going to create a situation where modern warfare would become incredibly destructive to those who would wage it, to the economies that would support it, to the governments that would be waging these wars. And in his La Guerre Future, he really predicted the catastrophes of World War I and the fall of empires. Very few people listened to him at the time, including very few among professional militaries, but Tsar Nicholas of Russia did. And it was the Tsar who suggested the first meeting at The Hague in 1898 that would explore the possibilities of avoiding catastrophic war. Needless to say, that meeting and subsequent Hague meetings did not change the course of events, but it did raise international consciousness and began processes of arms control, mediation, conflict resolution that to this day remain important, and I believe in the 21st century will become even more important. And as we meet rather ironically in the shadow of Russian aggression in Ukraine, it's important to remember there was a time when Russia was in the forefront of those countries hoping to avoid armed conflict. And for those who may have read in my book already, there's the further irony that over 25 years ago, I was asked by my government to lead a small group meeting with Russian cyber experts and also policy people, including, well, their delegation was led by a 4-star admiral and Russia's then top international lawyer. And the whole idea then, over 25 years ago, was to craft an arms control regime that would make it less permissive, the world less permissive of a place where strategic crime and political warfare and other aspects of cyber attacks would be controlled on a mutually agreed upon behavioral basis. I'll come back to say a few more words about that, but I think especially for this audience at The Hague, we should be thinking about the possibility that even though virtually all of information technology is dual use, that it can be used for commerce, for social life, as well as for military affairs, it is still possible to engage in behavior-based arms control, much as we have done with biological and chemical weapons conventions, which by and large are mostly adhered to in the world today and have been for decades. But let me begin by just sketching out what I think of in terms of cyber warfare. A lot of people consider it only having to do with cyberspace, and certainly a big slice of it is in cyberspace, but some of it is outside of that space and has to do with the way we will respond to the implications of technological change. So let's take the first aspect of this, political warfare. What do we mean by that? Well, for Americans, when you say that, it immediately harkens to the 2016 presidential election, when it's pretty clear that Russia's Internet Research Agency attempted quite significantly to influence the discourse about the election. But you have to go back well over 75 years to the American statesman George Kennan, who the father of the containment strategy in the Cold War, but he also wrote a wonderful study on something he called political warfare. And in it, it simply was content-based. We can't simply, when we think of political warfare, can't simply think of social media and cyberspace. We have to look beyond the conduit to the actual content and see there that in political warfare, there was a constant battle of the story underway. And certainly the technology of our time, this many-to-many medium that we've created in cyberspace allows many to have a voice. But ironically, a lot of the political warfare is waged by a handful of actual human beings and a very large number of robots or robot networks or botnets that are amplifying the messages of a relative handful of people. Well, this has been going on, this battle of the story, for a long time. I think it was essential in the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War that in the end, the Western story of free markets and free peoples was so appealing that even the Russians tried to rebuild their own society around glasnost, more openness, and perestroika, a restructuring along more market lines. That ended up being a kind of controlled crash for Russia in the 1990s. But it was a remarkable time in which democracy had a chance to flower, markets as well, although the oligarchs quickly got too much power. And it's a problem of embryonic democracies that these kinds of concentrations of power can occur. And the system was captured by an authoritarian over 20 years ago. But in that period of the 90s, there was really a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. And as I alluded to earlier, even at the level of kind of behavior-based controls on cyber warfare at the time. And the Russians, when I was part of this delegation, speaking with them, it was the Russians who put forward the idea of having mutual agreement not to engage in political warfare against each other. It was actually the United States that, when I went back and reported on this, that rejected the idea of this kind of control because there was the feeling that the United States and its friends and allies were way ahead of the Russians in cyber. And in fact, we could influence them politically. And there would be, we would be cutting off our own opportunities. And to which my response was, well, if we're ahead now, we're not going to stay ahead unless we come to some kind of mutual agreement about controlling our behaviors. And it's an unfortunate opportunity missed. And Russia, as we know, has taken a different path over the last 24, 25 years, and a very troubling one for the world. But I'm not about to lose hope. And I want to insist also that this political warfare problem is not just something aimed at the mature democracies of Western Europe or North America, but also at nascent democratic states that are just finding their ways out of authoritarianism. And what I see as I watch this is that Russian or Russian-affiliated cyber actors are there trying to influence the discourse in African states, trying to democratize, in Latin American states, in Asia as well. And this is a profoundly powerful tool being wielded, again, making it even more ironic that it was the Russians back in the late 1990s who were very interested in finding ways to control political warfare. And in some cases, in places like the Central African Republic, this political warfare goes hand in hand with boots on the ground, in this case, private military group, the Wagner Group, which has wielded tremendous influence on governance in the Central African Republic. So think about political warfare as, yes, emanating especially and being empowered by cyberspace, but going beyond it in increasingly powerful and often disruptive ways. The second aspect of cyber warfare that I describe is what I like to call strategic crime. Now, in the United States, we saw the mass disruptive possibilities of a form of this crime called ransomware, where an old system, a pipeline system called Colonial Pipeline, something built in the 1960s and run with software from the 1970s, was rather easily hacked, data held hostage, and disruptions caused over almost a third of the country for days on end. That's what makes this kind of crime strategic. It can have really powerful economic and social effects. Also, this kind of crime can be directed at the research and development intellectual property of the leading commercial firms of a country in the form of theft of intellectual property. Now, I'm just getting the figures on 2021, and it appears that the theft of intellectual property has resulted in the sale of counterfeit and pirated goods in 2021, amounting to over $2 trillion. So whereas ransomware is probably somewhere around $20 billion, we're talking about something roughly, 100 times the size of that as the overall realm of strategic crime. And this is possible simply because of very poor cybersecurity practices. And what do I mean by that? For decades, we have focused on firewalls, antiviral software, things that I refer to as Maginot lines, that basically the best hackers can simply walk through the firewalls, just as the Maginot line was outflanked and in some places penetrated in 1940. And instead of Maginot lines, I like to say, imagine no lines. Imagine that the criminals, the spies, the enemies will get inside whatever the system is. And if that's so, then your best defense is to follow two practices. One is to use the very strongest encryption ubiquitously at all times. And the second point is perhaps not simply to leave data sitting in your system, but rather to move it off out into the cloud or to the fog. The fog is sort of the edge devices between your system and the cloud. And I know the cloud is simply someone else's computer, but the point is it is somewhere else. It makes the job of the hacker that much harder to try to get at your data. And especially if you take sensitive, let's say, research and development data, encrypt it, break it into 5 parts and put it in different places in the cloud or in the fog. Now you've created a tremendous, tremendous problem. And I've written in Fortune magazine and other financial venues commercial venues about this, and I'm pleased to see that in multinational business enterprises, there's now a move much more in this direction. And finally, I've worked for the Navy the last 3 decades. Finally, I'm seeing in the US military some movement. The simple mantra here is that data at rest are data at risk. And instead of my Maginot Line metaphor, the American Pentagon has come up with the idea that every network should be looked at as a, quote, zero trust network. It's a typical, Pentagon formulation or like we say, a word salad. But what it means when they say zero trust is that whatever your network is, you have to assume that the bad guys are getting inside it. And so you need to take extra protective measures. I'm not saying this will solve every problem out there, but it will certainly reduce the theft of intellectual property worldwide. It will reduce the problems of strategic crime quite substantially. That said, both in the areas of political warfare, where I suggested arms control is a behavior-based agreements on rules of the road, or an international regime, whatever kind of terms you want to use would be useful. The same is, I think, especially true, and The Hague would be a wonderful place to really call for international agreement on curbing this kind of strategic crime. I think it is a pernicious problem that affects the prosperity and security of the world community, not just the prosperous leading developed nations, but emerging economies and lesser developed countries as well. And so I think this too should be on the agenda of an international agreement-based approach to solving what I call the new challenges of cyber warfare. The third aspect of cyber warfare that I discuss in my book has to do with military and security affairs. And here too, while cyberspace matters, it's something that goes beyond cyberspace to the broader issues of information management and what this means for the ways in which militaries will be organized and the doctrines that they will employ. And oddly enough, there's a lot of questioning about why haven't we seen more Russian cyber warfare in Ukraine? And that's mostly because people are thinking of it in terms of the strategic aspect of cyber warfare, much like the Russian attack on Ivano-Frankivsk's power infrastructure back in 2015, when the power was shut off for a while around the Christmas holiday back then. And I think there's a simple answer to that, which is that doing those sorts of attacks would mean very little in terms of the war aims that Vladimir Putin has there. He knows he can achieve whatever it is he's going after, and can only achieve it at this point with traditional armed force, which presumably what he's after is some kind of neutralization of Ukraine and keeping the country out of NATO, which hopefully there'll be a peace treaty and a ceasefire at some point on mutually agreed and not totally satisfactory to either side agreement, but that will at least stop the bloodshed. But I think that's the reason we haven't seen these kinds of strategic cyber attacks. What I do see, however, that I put in the realm of cyber warfare is the exceptionally skillful use and management of information by Ukrainian forces. In my chapter on military affairs, I describe a future in which military organization should be based on the idea of many and small units of action rather than a small number of large ones, divisions and army corps, things like that. And the Ukrainians have done that. Their basic unit of action is right down to the level of squads and platoons, between a dozen and 2 or 3 dozen soldiers. And what they're doing is empowering them with real-time information, largely gathered by handheld drones and other small remotely controlled aircraft that are able, and information coming in with text messages and such from the Ukrainian people who are kind of an observer corps on the ground, telling them where and when the Russians are moving. This then has allowed the Ukrainians to send as small as a squad of soldiers armed with very advanced weapons, which NATO countries have been passing to them, that allow them then to strike at these large Russian formations and to paralyze them for days on end, and even in some cases to counterattack here and there. So this is truly the kind of what I call Bitskrieg, the use of the bits and bytes to guide the bombs and bullets. And that's the untold story of the cyber war unfolding in Ukraine. We have to remember that cyber, the Greek root word, kybernetes, the kybernetes was the helmsman of the ancient ships in ancient Greece. And all it meant is to steer or govern. Modern cybernetics is about the whole idea of control through feedback, information flows. And so if we're willing, as David Runfelt and I, my old colleague from the RAND Corporation, said over 30 years ago, cyber means more than simply the conduits. It's about the content, the information. What can you know? Can you know more than your opponent? Can you gain more knowledge over time? And this is something that the Ukrainian military has done, I think, exceptionally well, and is the best explanation for their successes. So that's, I'm referring to cyber war at a very tactical level, but I want to come back to this idea of strategic attacks on infrastructure, what Americans like to call the cyber Pearl Harbor, the digital Pearl Harbor, whatever imagery you like. And I think in this case, there has been far, far too much attention given to this. I certainly have tried to suggest that there is much less than meets the eye to this whole idea of the cyber Pearl Harbor for a couple of reasons. One is if you just blink the light somewhere, well, the lights are going to come back on. Also, it usually takes very sophisticated cyber exploits to be able to cripple a communications system or an automated data control system. You only want to do that when the stakes are very high, when there's an actual shooting war between the major parties involved. And if the Russians, for example, had used sophisticated cyber weapons in Ukraine, then everyone observing that war would know what they were capable of doing, and they wouldn't be able to use it again. So I think unless the stakes are very high and cyber is the only way you can get something done, you don't want to use your best strategic tools. So that's another reason for the restraint we've seen probably in Ukraine. What else can I say about this? I do think there is room for behavior-based arms control when it comes to strategic cyber warfare as well. And this is something, and I'm deeply grateful to former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director Leon Panetta for being willing to listen to ideas of mine over the years and suggesting them to people like President Obama, who then, in a meeting with President Xi of China in 2015, actually explored the possibility of a cyber arms control agreement that would extend to not striking at the civilian infrastructures in each country or in any country if the agreement could be broadened. And I think that is something, President Obama is still a very young man. The Hague would be a wonderful organization to reach out to him, to get him to pick up the baton for this. President Xi is still running China. And I think China, as it becomes more and more dependent for its prosperity on secure information systems, as most developed societies are, I think this idea of a behavior-based agreement not to attack civilian infrastructures really could gain some important traction in the world. So at each of these levels, whether political warfare, strategic crime, or strategic military operations, there's a lot of room to explore arms control. Again, not on the basis of what's the experts call structural arms control, trying to control the technology or the fissile material, but rather controlling behavior, what they call operational arms control, or what I like to call behavior-based. We've seen in the biological and chemical weapons conventions that there is a strong behavioral basis for achieving these agreements and for them being adhered to. Again, the costs of cheating would be very high, and that would be something that would be part of these agreements, that that if you're in violation of them, certain steps would be taken to inflict cost upon you. So I think the possibilities are there. I'm not saying this would be an easy sort of thing. You have to get the whole arms control community really, which is so steeped in the nuclear arms control model, get them to think in a fundamentally different way and to realize that even though all information technology is basically usable for military means, there is a way nevertheless to agree on some kinds of conflict-based rules of the road. The last topic I want to touch on before we get to open discussion here, and I hope I will see some of your faces during discussion. By the way, if anyone wants to just show themselves now, that would be terrific. And before I talk about AI, let me just do thank you, Moon. Let me do a public service announcement, which is to say that, Neil, good to see you too, that the views expressed here are mine alone and do not reflect official American policy, as if there were any question about that as you were listening to me. But since we're recording here, and I'm sure this will be posted somewhere, if not everywhere, once things are out, you're shouting to the world. So let's make sure, Coriana, that we keep that disclaimer on the recording. So let me say a few words about so-called artificial intelligence. That term itself bothers me a little bit because by saying artificial, it means we have a bias against silicon-based intelligence. What are we? Just carbon-based intelligence, right? So we've got AIs that are the best chess and Go players in the world, that are setting strategies for major multinational firms, that are doing surgeries. The most complex surgeries are being done by robots. The robot will see you now in medicine. And there's all kinds of things that AIs can do. There is in the West this very interesting problem posed by certainly Hollywood with the Terminator and then later Matrix films about fearing the machines. And the late Stephen Hawking had a great deal of concern about the robots turning on us. And even Elon Musk of SpaceX and Tesla and Lord knows what else has also expressed a great deal of concern about robots in the future. I am more of the school of thought of Michael Crichton from many decades ago, who said that these are programmable entities and will be for at least another century or more. And these fears are things that, not that they should be discarded, but should be taken into consideration in our programming as we move forward, but should also be the subject of international law, international agreement. And it seems to me that there is an arms race in artificial intelligence underway right now. Outside of these commercial and social and industrial areas and medical areas, militaries are now gearing up with AI. And it seems to me that this is the moment to add AI to arms control. At the United Nations, there are efforts to provide some set of rules of the road for what they call lethal autonomous weapons systems, laws, if you will. I know the European Union has a position on this, that they should not be outlawed for militaries, but there should always be human command and control over them. This is not the case in other societies. In either Russia or China, for example, you have a willingness to allow AIs to operate quite freely. In cyberspace, there's a lot of robots operating in cyberspace every day, doing political warfare. They're the foot soldiers of strategic crime, and also are undoubtedly involved in the strategic military attack paradigm in terms of sending these AIs inside systems where they will lie in wait for the moment when a shooting war starts, then to cripple an opposing military's own command and control for some period of time at the outset of a new war. So these things are underway. there are capabilities, and again, aside from these being my views alone, I want to reaffirm that everything I'm saying is of an unclassified nature. So I'm going to talk for just a moment about a Russian example of a robot they've created that takes the form of a mini submarine that can go to great depths, the ocean floor, and it is programmed to be able to identify the fiber optic links that lie on the ocean bottoms around the world. And there are some 400 of these cables through which about 97% of all international communications flow. The Russians have a robot that's capable of tapping into or severing those ties, and they don't have a single one of these. They have several of these right now, and no doubt we'll have more. They deploy off an existing traditional submarine and then go further, and they're entirely operated on their own. The Chinese have what I like to call brilliant seagoing minds, which will sit on the bottom of the East or South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. And it has a little brain on it, and that brain allows it to detect what type of ship is passing above. And they can detect, for example, an American aircraft carrier, and then detach from the bottom of the sea, rise up, place itself under the keel of a ship, and then detonate, breaking the back of even the largest ship. So these kinds of weapons are coming online already, and they're out there. They're weapons that linger. Some of the anti-satellite weapons that are being crafted are also robotic in nature. So this arms race is well underway, and it is something that I think should also fall under the purview of an arms control, an international convention on the use and development and use of such weapons. I won't go further except to say that the way you have to look at it from, again, this cyber perspective of control through feedback is that military affairs are fundamentally transformed by the information age. Throughout all the thousands of years of preceding military history, warfare was mostly a question of how much mass and how much energy a weapon had and could be hurled at an opponent. Now, the information content of weaponry has grown enormously. Each individual weapon has a kind of brain to it. And it's this guidance package, this sensor and guidance package, that gives a tremendous power to even those small squads of Ukrainian soldiers. They're doing so well, in part because they have good information about where the Russians are. But the other part of the equation is they have weapons with huge brains. And so this too is part of the revolutionary change that the information revolution brings, the true cyber aspect of military affairs. And I'm not saying we can control the development of each and every one of these kinds of weapons, but it does seem to me that there should be international agreement that no one should be in the business of disrupting the fiber optic links that connect the world today. We've had conventions on telecommunications going back to the early 20th century, I think 1906, after the Berlin Conference in 1903, 1906, the first rules about this, and you'll find wording in that agreement about the nations of the world agree that they all benefit from these communications and will not disrupt them. This is something that we should be willing to revisit, much as we all know that it is imperative to control the development and use of weapons of mass destruction. We want to make sure that to every extent possible, we do the same when it comes to controlling weapons of mass disruption. So with that, I've gone a little over my 30 minutes here, Professor. Why don't we open up to questions, and hopefully there'll be a few answers too. But